Welcome to Stagecoach, where you'll find the best Western books on the market and the men and women who write them. This podcast is brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, home of the best-selling authors in the Western genre. This is your host, Ginger Winters. Thank you for joining us as we read Timber, U.S. Marshal, Texas Gun Runners, written by Robert Hanlon, read by Jerry Underhill.
Timber, U.S. Marshal, Texas Gun Runners, written by Robert Hanlon, published by Dusty Saddle Publishing, read by Jerry Underhill. Chapter 1. The wagon bounced and bumped around as it made its way over the rough desert ground. Most of the journey there were tracks and trails to follow, but some of the time the man driving it, and those with him, had to find their own way over open ground. The terrain was rough, and at times not really suitable for a wagon to travel over. At least there were plenty of men to help out whenever a wheel got stuck. They had 6 mules pulling the wagon, which they needed, as the load they were carrying was heavy. On board was a driver and a shotgun guard, both Army personnel. Riding alongside and to the rear were more soldiers. 12 of them in total. They were being led by a sergeant by the name of Patrick Glanton. He was a young officer, not long in the Army, but his skill and his intelligence gave him his rank early on. He was a thin, short man, very confident in himself and what he could do. He hardly ever took advice from anyone. Now here he was in command of an important shipment of arms for the Army. The wagon was loaded up with cases of Spencer carbines and Army Colt 44 revolvers, plus thousands of rounds of ammunition, all in sealed wooden cases. All of it was destined for Fort Duncan in Texas, close to the Mexico border. There were a lot of weapons in the shipment, and it was important they didn't fall into the hands of any outlaws or Indians, hence the big support of soldiers. Patrick Glanton kept a tight hand on his men, always checking they were where they should be and doing what he had told them. That might have caused some resentment, but for the fact he was a very amenable kind of person, as well as being strict. He just liked everything to be in order. They had been traveling for days now, all the way from Kansas, Missouri. The guns hadn't been on the wagon all that way. They had picked them up at Fort Worth near Dallas, Texas. All they had to do was take them the rest of the way to Fort Duncan. They had supplies and water on the wagon, and they did stock up on items at each town they came to. But there were still times when it seemed they just didn't have enough food. Not good enough food, anyway. The wagon stopped every day at noon to give the horses and men a rest, and to get some grub and a coffee, plus a chance for the horses and mules to graze. As was usual, several soldiers stayed close to the wagon as Glanton saw fit, while the others got their food and drink. Then they would swap over so they all got what they needed. They had been traveling for some days now, and they had all gotten into the routine, and they were happy enough. In some ways, it beat life in the fort, the dull routine there, as well as riding out on patrols. There was less discipline out here, although it didn't do to upset Glanton. At noon, 2 days out from the last town, Glanton had the first shift on guard at the wagon, watching those whose turn it was to get their food, which was prepared by the driver and shotgun guard. It was all basic stuff, but it was good enough, and it varied on what they could pick up in the town, supplemented by short hunting trips. Those who had food sat around to eat it, while the others stood guard. Once they had eaten, Glanton got the guards to stand down to take their break, while the second shift got back to guarding the shipment. So far there had been no problems. It had all gone to plan. No one had made any attempt to steal the guns, or even to come to them, so the soldiers were pretty relaxed. There was just now a couple of days or so to get to the fort. They were almost there, at the end of their mission. When all the troops had eaten and taken their rest, Glanton had them all pay attention.
"Now listen up. I want 6 of you to go take a ride around the rises you see ahead," he said, pointing to them. "This is a dangerous area, and I want that checking out before we move on."
He then carried on to say which soldiers would go. They got mounted up and moved out, while the rest of them carried on hanging around the wagon. Glanton watched the man go as he finished his cup of coffee. Just 2 miles away, 7 men were riding towards the wagon. They had been on the trail of it for a couple of days now and were catching it up. They had been advised of the route it would take by a telegram to the leader of the men at Dallas, and they had moved out from there. The leader was Roscoe Brown, an experienced outlaw having made several robberies before, and he had killed on the occasions when he'd had to escape from them. He was an ex-army man himself, and so he knew the ropes and how the soldiers at the wagon would be organized. He knew how many there were, what their experience was, and who was leading them. Roscoe knew he couldn't do the job of stealing the weapons alone, so he had roped in 6 other men to help him. They were all men he knew. 2 of them had been with him for a good while now, Clinton Fisher and Earl Daniels. The 2 men were close, having grown up together. They were of similar build, both tall, rugged, unshaven men who dressed in shirts, trousers, and long jackets. Both wore wide Stetsons, and both carried an Army Colt 44 tied down to their legs. Then there was a man who should lose weight in his line of business, but somehow just could never manage it. Ford Conbury was also a jovial kind of man, and if a joke could be made of anything, it would always be him to crack it. He also wore similar clothes to the others, but with a short jacket. Sandy King was tall, so much so he towered over the other men. He was also good with a gun. Even Roscoe, who was considered a fast draw and accurate shooter, would balk at a shootout with him. Sandy wore a dark-colored poncho. Harry Evans was a wiry little man who had been around when Roscoe was recruiting his men. He overheard what was going on and offered his services, which Roscoe accepted. The last man of the team was also the youngest, Bo Evans, who had blonde hair, lots of it, and a baby face which together got him jibes from other men. Not many of them lived very long, though, as Bo had a nasty temper he found hard, if not impossible, to control. The 7 of them had committed a range of crimes, and none of them ever had any second thoughts about doing them. All they cared about were themselves and getting the things they needed. They also all liked adventure, so their current job was just up their street. They had the chance to have a good time and to make plenty of money while doing it. What could be better for them? Roscoe considered his team as they rode through the dry scrubland. Clayton and Earl were like old friends. They had all worked together whenever their paths had crossed, which had been quite frequent. He knew them well, and what they were like. They were both good gun hands and quite trustworthy, to him anyway. Ford was a man he had met up with occasionally. He liked the good life, and he was a good man to have with you. He was always sure to lighten a tense moment with a joke or a quip. Roscoe had picked him up at a hotel he knew he liked to use. Sandy King was something else. None of the men liked him, and they all wondered if he was to be trusted. Being taller than any of them didn't help, nor did his long, morose face that never cracked into a smile. However, he was very good with his gun, and just the kind of man Roscoe needed for this job. He had known where Sandy hung around, and he had taken little persuading to join him. He didn't know much about Harry, only that he was keen to join them. Roscoe soon found out that he was a petty criminal with no morals like the rest of them, and he soon fit in with the team. Bo was a young man who was building a reputation for himself. His bad temper had already cost the lives of 3 men. He was handy with a gun, and he just seemed to enjoy using it. He hung around in the same place as Roscoe did, so it was inevitable that they would meet up and get to know each other at some time. Roscoe didn't like odd numbers, so he recruited him to make the even number of 6 men with him. They had spent some days in riding to where they now were. Roscoe knew they were bound to come across the wagon with the arms shipment soon. He kept on looking out for it as they continued riding. They passed by 2 towns on the way, and at each one they stopped and called in a saloon to wash the dessert sand away from their throats and to get something to eat, which was preferable from having to cook it themselves over open fires. They took a rest at each town,
knowing they had plenty of time to catch up with the soldiers and the wagon they had been told to look out for. After each town, they then moved on, getting further and further west from Texas. All the men had been told what their job was, and what to expect when they got to the wagon. None of them balked at knowing how many soldiers there were guarding it. They would have the advantage of surprise. Roscoe kept them going at a pace not too fast as to wear the horses out, but fast enough to cover the ground they had to do in time. He was looking forward to taking the rifles and guns from the army. They would take new ones for themselves and then sell the rest on. Roscoe already had 2 buyers lined up. He knew they could both be difficult, but then they would want what he had to sell, and he had his men with him, so he was sure all would be well.
Chapter 2.
Glanton had finished a second cup of coffee when he saw riders approaching. They were coming up on the trail behind the wagon, so most of the guards didn't see them until they were just a little way off. Those that did see them became alert and called out to the others to take a look. Glanton let the riders get closer before he called his men to close up on the wagon. As Roscoe drew his men closer to the wagons, he called out to them, "Now y'all know what to do. Just keep to the plan." He didn't get any answers, not that he expected to. All of them were determined and set on the job in hand. They all knew what was expected of them, and Roscoe knew they would do exactly that. He still shouted out the order, though. As they rode on, they began to spread out. Bo, Harry, and Sandy went over to the left. Clayton and Earl went over to the right, leaving Roscoe with Ford in the middle. Glanton saw them coming towards him and he ran over to the wagon. The outlaws kept on coming closer, all of them drawing their guns. It was only when the soldiers saw the guns being drawn that they brought up their carbines. "We're being attacked," Glanton called out as he got right up to the wagon. Once there, he looked out to see the outlaws closing in. "Prepare to fire," he shouted to his men. His call came too late, as they were already being surrounded. Roscoe rode in fast and aimed to take Glanton out as the only officer there. He took a careful aim and fired his gun once. Glanton's arms flew up over his head as he collapsed and fell under the wagon. Ford could see a soldier climbing up on the wagon in order to get a good aim at them. He fired twice to make sure of hitting the man, who then fell over the wooden cases. Clayton and Earl stayed close together, and as they came around the wagon, they looked for targets to fire at. The soldiers on that side didn't have much time in which to do anything. They brought up their carbines, but only one of them had a chance to fire a shot, which narrowly missed taking Earl's head off. Earl and Clayton opened fire, making as many shots as it took to ensure the soldiers fell dead. Bo, Harry, and Sandy were out to the left, where most of the soldiers' horses were. They rode around them, firing as they went. Sandy's first shot found its mark, killing a soldier standing beside the wagon. What Bo and Sandy wanted was to get the driver and shotgun guard. Harry was more interested in getting the driver, as being the least dangerous of them. The driver had been clearing up the cups and pots when the attack started, so he wasn't a real threat, and Harry took him down easily. The shotgun guard was a different matter. As Bo and Sandy came around the horses, the guard was up on the board of the wagon, waiting for them with his shotgun to his shoulder. Bo raced his horse around while leaning right down on the opposite side of his horse, and as he came close to him, he fired from under his horse's neck. His first shot hit the guard, stopping him from shooting. Bo's second and third shots took him down. Sandy found the soldiers to be easy targets, and he quickly shot one and looked for another man to shoot. He immediately saw one soldier who was trying to get his carbine onto him. Sandy took him out with one well-placed shot. Roscoe shot the remaining soldier, who was trying to hide behind a case of rifles, not well enough. It then went quiet as the shooting stopped. All 6 soldiers were lying dead on the ground or on the wagon, including the driver and the shotgun guard. Roscoe rode around them to make sure they were all dead. Then he called out to his men. "Okay, now we need to wait. There are only 6 soldiers here, and there are 6 more of them. They'll be coming back soon. Maybe very soon, if they have heard the gunshots. We need to be ready for them." "They'll see the dead soldiers," Bo called across to him. "Yes, they will. Prop them up around the wagon. They won't know these soldiers are all dead until they get close." That brought a few smiles and laughter from all the outlaws as their adrenaline calmed down. They all got busy arranging the bodies in position so as to look alive as much as possible. The temptation to reach into pockets and take items from them was too great for the men who had spent their lives robbing and killing. They worked quickly, and they soon had them arranged as best as they could. "Okay, now we get off to the side out of the way so as not to alarm them. Then as soon as they are in range, we gun them down," Roscoe said as he rode his horse out a few yards from the wagon. The other soldiers had heard the gunshots, and they were alarmed. The man in charge was a corporal. He had been leading the men around the rises and hollows in the direction they had been heading, without seeing anything of interest. Now he turned his troops around and headed back at a gallop. He came up on the wagon, seeing a group of riders out to one side. The troopers there all seemed to be sitting down. He rode on, slowing down a little, wondering what had happened, why there had been gunfire. He soon found out as he got closer. Roscoe had told his men what to do, and as the soldiers came up on them, they all spread out. The corporal carried on, wondering why the soldiers hadn't moved or called out to them. Then suddenly he realized what had happened as he saw the outlaws drawing their guns. He shouted out, "We've been attacked! Open fire!" His call came too late. Even as the words left his mouth, Roscoe shot him, then turned to aim at another soldier. By the time the soldiers could bring their carbines to bear on any of the outlaws, they were being gunned out of their saddles to fall into the dust. One of them did manage to fire a round, but it missed the man he had aimed at. All the outlaws kept on shooting until all 6 of the soldiers were dead. "Well done. Now we can look at what we got," Roscoe said, dismounting and going to the wagon. The rest of them joined him, and soon they were opening crates to find brand new rifles and revolvers, and boxes of bullets, as well as the equipment for making more. "There's a lot of 'em," Clayton said as the boxes were ripped open. "Yep, it's a good haul, all right. Just as we were told." Roscoe took a look and pulled a rifle out to look at. "Springfield carbines, brand new. These will sell easily." He smiled at the others, pleased with the day's work. They all took a good look at the rifles and guns, took what they wanted, with some of them putting their old guns in the crates. After they were all satisfied, Roscoe had the crates sealed up again. "We need to get on now. Ford, I want you to drive the wagon. Tie your horse to the back." "What about these soldier boys?" Ford asked. "Well, we'll leave 'em be. We ain't got time to do anything with 'em. No doubt more soldier boys will come for them eventually." Roscoe then mounted up, and as soon as they were all ready, he led them on, charging course for the hills. Once the outlaws had gone a good distance, Glanton sat up and took a look at the now distant wagon. He got up and dusted himself. Then he went to get his horse that had wandered off a ways. Once he had caught it, he mounted up and headed off for Fort Duncan. Chapter 3. Glanton rode on fast. He knew all his men were dead. He had lain under the wagon while most of the shooting took place, playing possum. Now he needed to get back to the fort and report what had happened. It had all happened so quickly, from seeing the outlaws arriving to them riding off with the wagon. Now all the guns and rifles were lost. The outlaws had them all. The whole shipment. He rode on quickly, having a good way to go before he got to Fort Duncan. It took him the rest of the day and part of the next morning to get there. He had taken a couple of hours' rest in the night, otherwise he had carried on under the moonlight. He arrived tired, dusty, and thirsty, having drank the contents of his canteen along the way. He rode in and went straight to the fort commandant's office. Captain James Higgins was inside, talking to his first sergeant, Jeff Kinney. Glanton went up on the porch and knocked respectfully on the door. He waited there until the sergeant opened it for him. "Sir, I have to see the captain," he said to him. "Come on in, Corporal," Sergeant Kinney told him, and stood aside to allow him to enter. Glanton walked straight up to the captain's desk, and stood there looking across it to where Captain Higgins was sitting. "What is it, Corporal?" Higgins asked. "Sir, I took a patrol to Dallas as requested to escort the shipments of guns and rifles back to the fort. But we were attacked some miles south of here by a gang of outlaws. I'm afraid they have taken everything." "Taken? How do you mean, man? Explain yourself." Higgins was immediately intrigued. "Sir, a band of men came up to us. They have killed everyone. I was the only one to get away, and then they took the wagon with all the cases of weapons on board." Captain Higgins glared at him. "Killed all the soldiers? Just how the hell did they manage that?" Glanton stopped and gathered himself together before he carried on. "I was very concerned about the way ahead of us from when we were stopped at midday yesterday, and I sent some of the men on to check it out. The outlaws attacked us while they were gone and killed all of them. Then when the patrol came back, they shot all of them as well." "Good heavens, man!" Higgins' mind was racing. "How did you get away?" "I feigned being dead. If I hadn't, they would have killed me as well. As soon as they had gone off with the wagon, I came straight here to tell you about it." "I can hardly believe it, soldier. Just how many men attacked you?" Glanton had been expecting this question. "I'm not sure, sir. Certainly enough of them. I saw 6 for certain." "6? How could 6 men take down 12 soldiers? What of the driver? Was there a guard on the wagon?" "They took us by surprise. One team was out on patrol. The rest of us were taking a midday break. It happened so suddenly. I'm afraid the driver and guard were also killed. We weren't expecting any trouble at that time and place." Higgins looked at his sergeant and shook his head. "We have been waiting for that shipment for a long time. It was all arranged." He looked back at Glanton. "Did you hear these men say anything? Did you get any descriptions? Come on, man. Tell me all of it." "I saw a few of them. They were dressed pretty much in black. They all wore long jackets, and they all had bandanas over their faces. They spoke. Didn't say anything about where they were going." "All right. Now start again from the beginning. Don't miss anything out. Sergeant, write it down." Glanton started again and told the whole story. The only part he didn't tell correctly was how he had got down under the wagon and feigned death when Roscoe had shot at him. Once he had finished, Higgins told him to go and see to his horse, and then to himself. As Glanton left, he then turned to his sergeant. "The territory governor needs to learn of this. Get a telegram to him right away." "Sir, that means sending a man to Eagle Pass for the nearest telegraph line." "Well, better get on with it then." "Yes, sir." Sergeant Kinney strode to the door to be stopped by the captain. "And when you've done that, take a detail out there with the corporal to show you where they were and bring our men back." Kinney turned to him. "Yes, sir, I will." He then saluted and went out, leaving Captain Higgins deep in thought. Sergeant Kinney hurried out and sent a soldier off with the message. Then he went to look for Glanton. He found him in the kitchen, helping himself to some food. "Glanton," Kinney said as he got up to him. He then looked all around to make sure they were alone before continuing. "How'd it go?" Glanton stuffed the rest of a piece of meat into his mouth before replying. He grinned as he said, "It all went to plan. No trouble at all." "Good. Higgins is sending a telegram to the governor." "Let him. What can he do? By the time they are organized, the guns will be sold." "Did you get the advance?" "Yep." Glanton handed over a cloth bag. "Your share is in there. Roscoe dropped yours and mine at the wagon." Kinney looked inside the bag, then closed it and put it away in a pocket. "Good. Okay. I'll go get the rest once they have sold everything. They have to come back this way. They won't renege on the deal. They are looking for more deals from us. The Army can be most accommodating. We'll get the rest of it. You wait and see. For now, though, we have some money to be going on with." "Yes, we do." Glanton grinned at Kinney. "Keep your head down for a while, okay? I have to go and bring those soldiers in, and you're going to come with me to show me where they are. I'll be back for you soon." Kinney gripped Glanton's shoulder then walked out. Glanton watched him go and patted the wad in his pocket. Everything was going to plan. It had been a good thing when Kinney had let slip about the arms shipment to the outlaws, but he'd had his own ideas. It was his plan that had brought it to completion. Now he was going to have to keep a close eye on the sergeant, and make sure he didn't tell anyone about it. Not ever. When he went off to meet with the outlaws again for the rest of the payment, he was going with them, whether he liked it or not. Glanton wasn't worried about any telegram getting to the Honorable Robert Pierce Fullerton, the territory governor. He was too far away, and who could he send to take a look at the robbery anyway? He knew Higgins would send a patrol out there looking for the wagon. Well, good luck with that, he thought. He walked out the kitchen feeling very safe and very sure of himself. The governor received the telegram later that day. He read it through twice, then sat at his desk thinking of what to do about it. What he needed was someone in the area to go out there and find out what had happened, who had committed the robbery, and, hopefully, straighten it all out. There was only one man who came to mind: Jake Timber. Roscoe was leading his men and the wagon on as fast as he could. He knew there wouldn't be any soldiers to come to them, at least for a good while. He had dropped a small amount of cash to keep the soldiers happy he had dealt with. He was supposed to pay them a lot more from the profits of the sales, but he had no intention of doing that. He also knew that when soldiers did come out to collect their dead men, it would be the soldier he had made the arrangements with leading them, so there would be no real danger there. But even so, he wanted to get on. It never paid to take any chances he didn't need to. Their first stop was to be the closest town, which was Eagle Pass. They rode in there, keeping the wagon in between them. Roscoe had a couple of buyers lined up. They were chicken feed for what else he had in mind, and what had been set up for him. But it was a good start, and took them nearer to their first big sale. They rode along to the end of the street, where a saloon stood, and the livery stable next to it. Next to that was a barn they took the wagon to. Once the wagon was inside, Roscoe said, "Okay, y'all wait here except Clayton. Clayton, you come with me." Clayton walked with him to the saloon. Inside, Roscoe looked around, then beckoned across to two men he could see at the bar. Seeing him, the two of them walked over. "You got it?" one of the men asked. "Yeah, we got it. Come and take a look." Roscoe then led the way back out. These two men had also heard the conversation in the saloon that first day, and they wanted in on the action, which Roscoe was only too pleased to oblige them with. At the barn, Roscoe took the men to the wagon, while his own men stood around some feet away watching them. Roscoe opened a crate and pulled out a rifle. Then from another crate, a revolver. "Here you are, brand new, as promised," he said, handing them over. The two men gathered around the crate and handled the weapons until Roscoe said, "Well, are you happy?" The man who had greeted him looked at his friend and said, "You happy with them, Joe?" "They look fine to me, Larry," he answered, still handling the rifle. "Yeah, that's fine. We'll take 'em." He handed Roscoe a bag, which he opened to check the contents. Once Roscoe had taken a look, he said, "Okay, take the guns." He watched as the man took a rifle and a revolver each, and boxes of ammo. "Good guns here. You done well. So where next?" Larry asked. "Since you are asking, there are some Apache over at Robin Hill who want to buy from us." They all laughed. "Indians? Well, good luck with that. They won't have enough to pay for all that stash, though," Larry added. "Nah, we got us some bandits to sell to as well. Border bandits right up in Canyon Valley." "Sounds good. You should do well," Joe told him. Harry asked, "What do you want those guns for?" Larry sneered and looked at his friend. "Hey, Joe, he wants to know why we want these." "Huh, Larry, what does he think we need them for?" He turned to Harry. "We got us some things we want. Now we have a way to get them." "You need a hand with that?" Harry asked. They looked at him, as did Roscoe. Seeing Harry's face, Larry laughed. Sure, okay, if you think you're up to it. Harry brought himself to his full height. You bet. He looked at Roscoe. I'm losing interest in the guns, Roscoe. I'll stay here. I'll stay here. Roscoe wasn't happy, but he let it go. If the man didn't want to be with him, then he was better cut loose. Okay, you stay here. He watched as Harry walked over to join Joe and Larry and went out with them. When they were alone again, Roscoe said, Okay, boys, it's time to move on to our next sale. Larry and Joe were very happy with their purchases, especially as they had a certain use for them, and to have another hand to help them get what they wanted. Now we can get what we need, Larry said. Good job, Larry. We've been hanging around here waiting for these guns long enough. You always were impatient, Joe. Come on. Oh, and Harry, don't wave that thing around, he said to him as Harry was playing with his new rifle. The three men walked out and then rode over the street and a little way up to the general store. There they stopped and tied their horses to the hitch trail. Okay, now, we make this fast and get out of here with no hassle, Larry told them. They strode in fast and found the storekeeper alone in there. Larry hurried over to him, while the other two took the items they wanted off the shelves. Open the till, Larry told the man. But you, he started. Just do it, Larry said, aiming his new revolver at him. The man opened the till, then Larry pushed him out of the way, leaned over and took all the money out of it. Then he turned to go. Y'all ready? He asked Joe and Harry. Yeah, let's go, Joe said. Just as they were coming out the store, the sheriff and his deputy just happened to be walking by. As they got to the door, the storekeeper called out to them that he was being robbed. Larry stepped back, seeing the lawmen. The sheriff drew his gun, calling out for them to drop their guns, but the men were too excited and anxious to do any such thing. Larry brought his gun up only to have the sheriff shoot him dead. The deputy shot Joe as he dropped the items in his arms and drew his gun. The sheriff and his deputy then aimed at Harry, who dropped what he was holding and held his hands up. Don't shoot, I give up, he called out. Chapter 4. Jake Timber was sitting at his favorite table in the Aces High saloon in the small town of El Calo. He had been in the town for some time, longer, in fact, than he usually stayed in one place. He'd had outlaws to search out, and also a band of kidnappers from the same town, which had taken some time to do. He had been out after the outlaw Downing brothers, and he'd had an unlikely ally to work with. Flynn Ferguson was a bounty hunter, and he had been on the trail of the same men. That resulted in all the brothers being killed, and Flynn getting wounded. Timber had left him at the doctor's here in town to be patched up. He hadn't seen him since, or while he'd been chasing down the kidnappers that he'd just got back from. He had assumed he had got well enough to go off on the trail of another outlaw. He was pleased, really, as he liked to work alone. He sat facing the room with his back against a wall, which is where he always liked to be. Being able to see who was coming in had saved his life at least once before. He had a beer with him as he played solitaire with his battered pack of cards. He finished the game, then sat back and pulled a telegram from his pocket, which the telegraph operator had sent over to him by a boy who worked for him. The telegram was from the territory governor. He read it through again. It told him of how outlaws had stolen a shipment of guns from the army and were in his area. It asked him to go and investigate and see what he could do about retrieving the shipment. It also told him that some of the guns had been recovered in a robbery at a town not that far away, Eagle Pass. It all sounded very interesting. He finished his beer, put his cards in his pocket, and stood up. Walking out, he nodded to the barkeep he'd got to know, not knowing if he'd ever see him again. He went to his horse at the hitch rail, a big chestnut he had named Scout. He mounted up and turned him in the street to head out west for Eagle Pass. He had a 2-day ride to get there, so he stopped off at the store to stock up on a few supplies. The storekeeper was pleased to see him and recognized him. Hey, Timber, what do you need? Just a few items to get me going for a couple days. Well, help yourself. There'll be no charge. Timber looked at him.
Really?
Sure. Man, you got all the bank money back for us from when those outlaws robbed it. Shucks. I have a stash in there, and I would have lost it all if it hadn't been for you. Timber nodded.
Okay. But I won't take advantage. I'll just take what I need.
No problem, Timber. It's a pleasure. You help yourself. Timber took what he thought he would need and showed the storekeeper what he had. The storekeeper waved his arms at him. That's fine. Say, you on the trail of another outlaw?
Yeah. Several.
Really? You sure keep busy. Well, best of luck with that. Timber thought he'd need it as he walked out. He put the items into his saddlebags, then mounted up.
Here we go again, Scout,
he said as he urged the horse on. He rode on until he figured it was time to stop. He found a good place to make a camp and cooked himself some of the store's food. The night passed by uneventfully, and then the next day he carried on toward Eagle Pass. The town came up eventually. It was close to the Texas-Mexico border, as indeed was Fort Duncan just a little way south of the town. It nestled on the banks of the Rio Grande, which wound around the fort and the town. Timber passed the town sign and headed into Ferry Street. A little farther on, he turned into Jefferson and searched the sheriff's office. He finally found it, and leaving Scout at the hitching rail, he went inside. As he entered, a man was busy at a rifle cabinet. He turned as Timber entered. "Can I help you, mister?" he asked.
I sure hope so. I've ridden a ways to see you.
The man locked the cabinet and turned to face him. "So what's so important?"
I'm guessing you're the sheriff here?
"Yeah, Sheriff Duke Harrison." He pointed to a star pinned to his shirt.
I'm Jick Timber, and I'm told you have a prisoner here I need to speak to.
"Now, Mr. Timber, why would you want to do that?"
It's just Timber. I don't want to see him because he committed a robbery here, using a rifle stolen from a shipment of arms destined for the Army at Fort Duncan.
"You seem to know an awful lot, Timber. Just where did you get that information from?"
Let me tell you, I am a U.S. Marshal, retired.
Timber flashed a badge from a pocket. Then he took the telegram from another and held it out.
This will explain some of it.
Harrison took it gingerly and read it through. Then he looked up at Timber.
It still doesn't explain why it's you he's asked to investigate. It's an Army problem, surely.
Timber sighed and took another piece of paper from a pocket. It was getting rather ragged, but the writing was still perfectly legible.
You need to read this as well.
Harrison took this one to his desk and sat down to read it. As he did that, Timber walked a few feet toward the cells he could see at the back of the office, and the single man who was in one of them. As he was looking at him, Harrison finished reading. "This gives you carte blanche to do anything you damn well like." He looked amazed at Timber.
That's right, Sheriff. As for the Army, yes, it is their matter, and they may want to investigate. But it's my job as well. And seeing as the governor has asked me to do it, I'll get on with it. Now I want to talk to your prisoner.
Harrison sighed and got up. "Okay, let's go talk." He led the way to the cell and stood aside to let Timber see the man in there clearly.
What's your name?
Timber asked him through the bars. The man stayed seated and just answered.
Harry? Well, Harry, it seems to me you're stuck between a rock and a hard place here. You stole weapons belonging to the Army, then used them to commit a robbery.
"We bought the guns," he said grumpily.
Stand up,
Timber demanded.
Why should I? Because if you don't, I'm coming in there, and I'm going to tan your lousy hide, then pin you to these here bars.
Harry looked at him, then at Harrison. Seeing no help there, he slowly raised himself to his feet.
That's better. Now I want to know all about the men you bought the guns off, who they are, where they're going, and anything else you know. Oh, and don't leave anything out.
I don't see why I should tell you anything.
Sheriff, go get me the key, will you?
Harry watched in amazement as Harrison went off to do just that. He returned and handed the keys to Timber. Timber unlocked the door and stepped in the cell as Harry backed off to the far wall. "You can't touch me. That's an offense. The sheriff here will tell you that," he said, pushing his arms out towards him. "First off, the sheriff isn't going to say a word. Secondly, I can do anything I damn well please, as Harrison here said." Harry began to tremble. Timber towered over him, being a much bigger man in all directions. "You keep away from me. I'll tell you all I know," Harry blubbered. "That's better. I'll start talking. I was with 2 other men. One of them, Larry, had found out from some army guy about the guns coming in, and he arranged for us to have some before the gang of men who were stealing them went off with them to sell them on to someone else." "Who is this army guy?" Timber interrupted him. "I don't know his name. He never said it." "Now, don't you go lying to me." "I ain't. I told you I don't know. How the heck should I know? Larry did all the talking." "I done told you not to lie to me once, Harry. I won't tell you again," Timber said, as he grabbed Harry by his shirt front. Okay already. I heard the name Patrick mentioned about him going to get the guns." "Good. Now we're getting somewhere. Okay, go on. Don't try and tell me you weren't involved with them." "Shucks, Timber, it was a mistake. I shouldn't have joined up with them. I left when we all got to town." He looked at Timber and carried on. "We turned up with the guns in a wagon. We showed what we had to Larry and Joe, and they bought the rifles and revolvers. Then, yeah, okay, I joined up with them, and we went to rob the store. We needed stuff." "We're getting there slowly. Tell me of the men you were with." "There were 6 of them, all big guys. One very tall. All of them were a miserable, dirty lot. Not the kind of men you get riled up. Not the kind of men I'd normally get mixed up with." "Their names?" "Heck, Timber, come on. I told you loads now. I can't remember any names." Timber made one step and reached out for Harry. "Oh, goody. More entertainment." He picked him up off the ground by his shirt front. "I told you to tell me everything, and that includes names." He let him down again, causing Harry to stumble. "Roscoe, all right?" he shouted out. "That was one. He was the leader." "And?" Harry was getting upset. He turned to Harrison. "Sheriff, help me out here, will ya? This guy's intimidating me." "Just answer the questions, Harry," he said. He had tried to question Harry before, and he was surprised and pleased at how easily Timber was getting some answers. Harry paused, and seeing Timber's face, he carried on. "Clayton was another name I heard, and Bo. He was a young'un with long blonde hair." "Any other names?" "No, Timber, I swear. I didn't hear any others. You gotta believe me. I only joined them a short time ago. None of them were keen to give me their names." Timber looked into Harry's eyes, and he let it go for now. "Okay. Now I need to know where they're going to sell the guns." Harry stopped talking. He was thinking fast. "If I tell you, will the judge go easy on me?" Timber turned to Harrison. "Sure. Helping the law is bound to help you, give you a lower sentence." Harry sighed. "Okay. All right. They said something about Apache Indians." Timber took that in, as did Harrison. Then Timber said, "Where are these Apache they're going to?" Harry looked at Harrison as he answered, "Robin Hill." Timber then looked again at Harrison. "I knows it. I'll give you directions." "You've been very cooperative, Harry. Thanks." Timber smiled at him and went out the cell. He locked the door and gave the key to the sheriff. "He's all yours now. So tell me about Robin Hill." Harrison walked back to his desk and picked up a piece of paper and a pen. "I'll draw it out for you. Easier that way," he said. Moments later, he handed Timber the piece of paper. "I hope you find them," he said. "So do I." Timber took the paper and walked out. Chapter 5. Timber had watched Harrison draw the map and explain it to him as he worked. He now had a good idea of where to go. He mounted Scout and headed out, with enough information to hopefully get a head start on the outlaws. Robin Hill was a fair old distance away in the Davis Mountains. Timber knew he had a day or two's ride to get there. The outlaws already had a good start on him of 2 days, but with them having the wagon, he could quite probably narrow that gap with keeping Scout on a walk, jog, lope cycle to keep going as fast as possible, but not wear his horse out. Not that that would be an easy thing to do. Scout was a big horse, and capable of keeping going for a long time. Timber put him to it, and carried on riding into the day. As night came, Timber kept on it until it became dangerous to carry on. He didn't want Scout to put his foot in a gopher hole or to do something to make him lame. He stopped when he decided enough was enough, and let Scout graze, knowing he would return at a whistle. Although he had supplies with him, Timber ate light on jerky and biscuits with coffee. He then turned in, but only got a couple hours sleep before waking up again. Everywhere was quiet, and he could see Scout close by. The dreams had woken him again. Ever since his wife and child had been murdered, he had the dreams of how it had happened, and how he had killed the murderer. He'd been found guilty and had been in jail a while before the governor had set him free, giving him the job of cleaning up the territory, knowing what Timber's skills were. On nights like this, he knew he wouldn't be able to sleep again, so he made more coffee, thinking of his current job. Bringing in 6 men and finding all the stolen cases of rifles and guns was a tall order, especially as he was going to be close to Apache Indians in order to do it. He just hoped he would be able to manage it and find the 6 men, with hopefully a lot of the guns still with them. Even before it started to get light, Timber prepared to go off again, and just as the sun was beginning to rise, he rode out on Scout, anxious to find his men. Eagle Pass was some way behind him now. It had been the first time he'd been to the town, and he had learned from the sheriff that Fort Duncan was just a few miles south of there. So the shipment of guns couldn't have been that far away from the fort when they were attacked. He wondered if there was a reason for that. He would have thought it wiser to attack it a whole lot farther away from where soldiers may be out on patrol, and where they can make a quick response once the alarm had gone out. Maybe he'd figure that out once he caught up with the outlaws responsible. Roscoe led his men in the wagon further north and into the foothills of the Davis Mountains. It was slow work with the wagon, especially as it broke down twice on the way, and they had to spend time mending it. He had a good idea where his next customer was, but he was still going to have to look around for them. He knew the band of Apache he was headed for had a base in the mountains somewhere close to Robin Hill. He knew roughly where that was, but he'd been told not to worry, and that once he got close to them, the Indians would find him. That was fair enough. Roscoe didn't want to know where their camp was. He only wanted to sell rifles and guns to them for as much as he could get, and then move off as fast as he could. He looked around at the men he had with him. Ford was driving the wagon, with Clayton and Earl riding on either side of it. To the rear were Sandy and Bo. They were all holding their positions as agreed while he rode out in front. He wasn't sure about these Apache he was going to. He had been told from the fort that they sometimes went there to trade, but infrequently. They were usually Seminole, sometimes Comanche. Roscoe had dealt with Seminoles before, but never with Apache. He just hoped the deal would go down uneventfully. These Apache were apparently renegades, and they were after rifles in which to fight whites with. The only way they could get sufficient weapons was through buying them. Roscoe was happy to sell to anyone, and he would offer to bring them more supplies in order to help him get away from them with his scalp intact. As they rode on, the terrain began to change from flat desert land into rises and hollows, of which the rises got higher and the hollows shallower. He had wondered about getting the wagon up there, but the route he had been advised to use was quite impossible to navigate. He kept his eyes open and looked around the whole time they continued. He knew the Indians would see him way before he saw them, but he still looked out for them, as did the other men. As time went on, they got to a hollow that was turning into a steep-sided valley where he was told they would need to go through to get to the Apache. He raised a hand and stopped. "What is it, Roscoe?" Ford called to him, as nervous as the rest of them.
"I don't know. I just want to take a look, see here before we go any farther."
Bo rode up to him. "You expecting trouble here, Roscoe?" Roscoe shrugged.
"You can't trust an Indian."
Bo nodded. "I guess not. Then again, I don't trust anyone." Roscoe looked at him.
"Not a bad way to be, kid."
He then looked again along the hollow that stretched in front of him a ways before turning off, so he couldn't see any further. "So what we doing here, Roscoe? We going in or not?" Bo wasn't known for his patience. Roscoe grinned at him.
"Okay. This is as far as we go."
Ford jumped down. "It's about time. I've had my fill of driving these damn mules."
"Unhitch them. Come on, all of you. Help get these mules loaded. We got a ways to go yet,"
Roscoe said, dismounting and getting busy. They unhitched all 6 mules and then began to load the crates of rifles and revolvers onto them. The wooden pack carriers were in the wagon in case the wagon had to be abandoned, and the mules used. All 6 were loaded up. Ford untied his horse from the back of the wagon and led him around to where the others were all waiting.
"Okay,"
Roscoe said.
"Now we split up. Clayton, you and Earl take Bo with you and get on to the border. Ford and Sandy, come with me. Once we finish with the Apache, we'll go over to Little Rock and wait for you there. Then we split up the takings, go our own ways."
They all knew where Little Rock was. They had followed the wagon on from there a few days back. Clayton turned to Earl and Bo. "Okay, come on, we'll take 1 mule each. Let's ride." He took the reins of one animal and started off. The other 2 got their mules and followed on. Once they had gone, Roscoe then turned to Ford and Sandy.
"We take it easy from here on in. I still don't understand why we can't all go together,"
Sandy said.
"We discussed this. It's better if we split up. We won't look so menacing to the Indians we are going to see, and if the army does come after us, then being split up will make it easier for us, harder for them. Now come on, we gotta get going."
Roscoe then led them off along the hollow. Timber carried on riding towards Robin Hill. Now and then he checked with his map to make sure he was on the right route. He passed a couple of landmarks Harrison had drawn out for him and kept on. He had been riding up into the foothills of the mountain, and as he came over a rise, he stopped as he saw the wagon ahead. All there was the wagon. No mules, no horses, no men. He looked all around. Were the outlaws lying in wait for him somewhere? If they were, he couldn't see them. Slowly, he advanced on the wagon. When he got there, he could see it was empty. It wasn't what he had been expecting. So they had somehow removed the guns. Had someone met them? Had they all been sold and gone? Or had something else happened? Timber dismounted and carefully checked the ground all around the wagon. He came to the conclusion that no one else had arrived, so the only thing he could think of was that they had loaded the guns on the mules and moved on. He was more sure of that just a few yards away, where he saw there were now 2 sets of tracks going off from the wagon. One going into the hollow he could see, and the other going north, west of there. He sighed, wondering which one to go after first. Then it became clear. He only knew of Robin Hill as being a destination for them, and that was through the hollow. He would have to go that way and straighten out who was there first, and hope to get information from them as to where the others had gone. If not, he would have to come back and try to follow what then could be a cold sign. He got back up on Scout and headed him along the hollow. Chapter 6. Roscoe rode along very cautiously, wondering about the Indians and whether they had already seen them. He was still a little way from Robin Hill, where he knew arrangements had been made for them to meet up, but was still cautious even this far out. Dealing with Indians is something he had done before, but never on this scale or with Apache. He just hoped they would be like the others he had met. No doubt they would want to haggle, but he was prepared for that. For some reason, he just didn't trust these Indians. For one thing, He hadn't been in on the arrangements, so he didn't know what had been said, or how many rifles they actually wanted. He also didn't know how many would be there when he found them. It was not a meeting he was looking forward to. He had Ford and Sandy close up to him.
"You two keep your eyes open now. I don't want no sudden surprises from any Apache," he told them.
His nervousness was affecting them, too.
"You sure we should be doing this, Roscoe? Maybe we should go find someone else to sell these guns to,"
Ford asked him.
"You got someone in mind?"
Roscoe asked, turning to look at him.
"Heck no, Roscoe. Just saying, that's all." "Yeah, well, we're into this now. We got a lot of guns here to sell. This arrangement has been made. We have to carry it through." "We got anyone else lined up if this goes tails up?"
Sandy asked.
"No. We would need to find another buyer. Not easy. Maybe a gun shop would take them, but not likely." "What about us abandoning this and going on to join up with the others? Sell them all on together?" "Not that easy, Sandy. The men Clayton is going to only want so many, and they sure will have enough with what he has. We need to sell these on ourselves. We just need to take care. The Apache want them, and will pay us. They won't want to harm us, as they will probably want something more when they can afford them."
Sandy didn't answer. The uneasiness Roscoe had shown was now showing up on him and Ford. But as Roscoe said, they just had to carry on now and meet the Apache. Some miles from them, Clayton was riding along with Earl and Bo. Although he wasn't going to meet up with any Indians, he still figured he had a tough customer to sell to. The man from Fort Duncan had made the arrangement for them to go close to the Texas-Mexico border and meet up with a renegade band of banditos. They had been causing all kinds of bother along the border, with some skirmishes deeper into Texas, as well as cattle raids and robberies. There were 20 of them, all led by a particularly evil man called Carlos Lopez. He had been into all kinds of crime, first by himself, then with other men pretty much all his life. Even as a boy he had learned how to pickpocket, and had always been in trouble of some kind. He had worked his way up in the current band of outlaws he was with over several years. His ruthlessness had carried him through. He had no empathy for anyone. He was only interested in himself. Over his time with them, he had proved his worth by killing anyone who slightly disagreed with him, or beating them to a pulp. Any prisoners that they had soon learned just how cruel and merciless he was. He was a big man, towering over most of the others. As with most of them, he had a stubble and a well-weathered face from being out in the sun all the time. He wore a less-than-white shirt and baggy brown trousers with long boots. Over his shirt, he wore a waistcoat, a sombrero on his head. The men he had with him wore similar clothes, and they were all very careful of what they said to him, so as not to cause any offense. The band of men engaged in a variety of harassments along the border, including cattle raids, vendettas, and vigilantism. Carlos had honed his band of men to a fierce fighting force. What they needed now was a fresh supply of guns and ammo to continue their escapades with, as well as a special raid he wanted to do. He had been lucky in that he knew of a soldier at Fort Duncan who had been talking at a saloon in Eagle Pass. Overhearing the conversation, Carlos had gone over to him and talked some more. He learned of the rifles and guns coming from the east, and that they would be stolen and sold off. Carlos wanted those guns. He knew he wouldn't be able to intercept the wagon load himself, so he agreed to buy them from the men that were going to get them, and an arrangement had been made. Now his band was in the foothills of the Davis Mountains, waiting for the guns to arrive. The area was well known to them, as they had been through it many times on sorties into Texas from Mexico. They had been busy raiding a farm Carlos had been interested in. They had been low on supplies, and he figured the farm would have been able to help them out. Turned out they had. They had been able to get some chickens, a hawk of pork, and some crops. Altogether, it made for enough to keep them going for a while. The problem had been with the farmer who had tried to stop them. Carlos had told him not to argue with them, but he kept on about them taking his things. It came to a head when he came out with a shotgun and threatened Carlos with it. Carlos hadn't batted an eye. He had drawn his gun and shot him. As they rode out, his wife and 2 sons went out to him. Carlos wasn't bothered. The man shouldn't have tried to stop him. They were now in the camp that they had been using for a couple of days. It was in a gorge between high rocks that served as a watchtower for his men to keep watch over a large area of the mountains. The camp only had one way in, which was a good thing in that if anyone came to them, they couldn't get out, and there was only one way they could be attacked. But it also meant they could be trapped inside, which was why Carlos insisted on constant guards on the rocks. Clayton and the 2 men with him carried on, climbing up the foothills, slowly winding their way up while watching out for the banditos all the time. Timber sat easily on scout, as he rode along the gorge he had entered, which turned around a corner partway in. He took care on the bend, but he needn't have bothered as there was no one around or anything to cause him any alarm. He was always uneasy at approaching Apache. He knew some could be quite friendly, especially if they wanted something. But he'd also had occasions when they were downright dangerous. He knew the ones the outlaws were going to were expecting them, and so could be safe to meet. But even so, Timber was hoping to catch up with the men before they reached the Indians. That would make things so much easier for him.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Stagecoach, brought to you by Dusty Saddles Publishing, the home of Western excellence, where the best of the Western authors can be found. Visit our website at dspublishingnetwork.com. Please join us for our next episode as we continue with Timber, U.S. Marshal, Texas Gun Runners, written by Robert Hanlon.